And goodbye to Chad here. So welcome to Lug here, and we'll let Stephen take it away with talking about Steam Deck on as used as a Linux tablet.
So anyways, I'm Stephen Hadley. And I think two of my, can everyone hear me all right before I really get going?
Can people hear Stephen?
I can.
Yeah, I
Okay.
can hear you fine.
Great. So anyways, two of my kind of long-standing Linux interests have been for a while is, distributed computing, big data crunching analysis as kind of a professional hobby. And like, for whatever reason, I don't know, I've kind of gotten kind of fascinated by ultra portable small form factor computers. And kind of my broad journey to this is I had a Droid 2 phone that I root, and I had Debian running, and I found it extremely useful to have like a full real Linux operating environment like in my pocket round going everywhere. And that became less useful as Android changed over the years. And I eventually replaced that with a Nexus 7 that was running Arch Linux with a Tegra processor in it. That was that model. And I replaced that with a GBD Pocket, which is a Cherry Trail 7-inch laptop. So both the Nexus 7 and the Cherry Trail are 7-inch, and I found 7-inch is a really nice form factor for me, but kind of not always wonderfully supported. And when Steam announced that they were announcing a 7-inch form factor computer, I was very intrigued. The gaming part I'm using a lot more than I thought, but also just as a general purpose device, I was very intrigued. So I've reserved mine a while ago. I think they came out in January or February, and I have been, I've had mine for I think a month, and I've been using it a lot and kind of having a lot of fun tinkering with it. It seems to have some kind of interesting, at least from my perspective, software choices in addition to being interesting hardware. And kind of one of the most salient, interesting hardware or software choice I have is their shipping hardware factory installed Linux, which kind of fits into this group. And so they've switched they've used SteamOS, I think, before for their Steam machines. I think it was previously based on Ubuntu. I think they've moved to being based on Arch Linux, which I've been a long time, many years now, Arch Linux fan. So I was very excited to hear that. And I've been kind of using it as a more or less daily driver as a laptop, still using my desktop as well. But doing a lot of things with it. And I found, I thought I'd share some of the things that I've learned about it, some of the weird, quirky things, and some of the bits of software that I've learned about it, and maybe it'd be interesting for the group. And maybe other people have these devices as well, or are interested in them, and kind of from a Linux user's perspective of kind of some new hardware that runs Linux. So. Okay, so let's go click next slide. So what is this thing? So it is a Linux tablet from Valve Corporation. It runs a factory installed Arch Linux variant called SteamOS. It has two different launchers, two different desktop experiences, essentially. It has a Steam launcher that it'll boot into Steam, and that'll be the entire like desktop display. And it also has what's called desktop mode, which is a KDE Plasma environment. It uses a semi-custom Ryzen AMD APU. I believe it's roughly equivalent to 5800 mobile, something like that. I think a big drawback as far as a drawback, like the screen is the really high point for me, but it's also kind of a drawback. I think the 7-inch size is I really like. 1280 by 800 is a little bit on the lower resolution side, but the pixel density is actually really nice. So there's some compromise there. I think it's a 60 hertz display, but and I think that's for general computing, that's perfect. I think for some gaming things that maybe that has some drawbacks. I believe it's IPS, and but it's not the brightest screen there ever was. and it doesn't have the highest resolution. So it's a lot of compromise on the screen, but I think it's a big part of how they're hitting the price point they're hitting, which is kind of amazing. The spoiler to the last bullet there. 16 gigabytes of RAM. Interesting kind of layout there. They're using LPDDR5, and they're using it as kind of flexibly between the CPU and GPU, I believe, and which I think is kind of thing APUs do. But I guess fast DRAM instead of VRAM kind of it operates surprisingly better on a GPU side than I would have thought for operating out of DRAM. And again, runs on KDE Plasma. It has really interesting integrated touchpads. It uses the touchpads in desktop mode as the right side as a virtual trackball. So instead of just like behaving like a laptop touchpad, it has like different acceleration properties that like allow you to flick it like a trackball, which I find really, really wonderful. But again, I don't know, for anyone in the room, I'm a trackball fan from a long time. So it really fits with me really well. And I find it tremendously better than most laptop touchpads, which is weird because it's really small, but I find it works better. And then use the left one as a scroll, as your scroll. So you can scroll with your left, all the different directions you want to scroll, and then you can move the mouse with the right. And then they also use the trackpads as the on-screen keyboard. So instead of trying to like contort your thumbs to try and reach and do the touchscreen, you can do it through the touchpad, which it's always in the same place, and it has a lot of the same benefits of what I find like a trackball. I don't have to like move myself around. I can just leave my hands and my thumbs and my fingers where they are, and it's really convenient there. Interesting thing is like the only differentiation, more or less, between the different price points is how big the internal NVMe or not NVMe is. And but if you choose to get one with a very small NVMe that has an SD card reader that is relatively fast, I believe it is. I believe it is. They have a customization. To answer Tim's question about whether the behavior is swappable, they have a full customization option to allow you to basically customize all of the controls on the touchscreen. And I can tell some of the customizations that I've made. But yeah, I think they can swap it for lefties. But by default, right is mouse, left is scroll. Anyways, and going back, they have a really pretty fast SD card reader, as far as I can tell, and with support for up to 1 terabyte. So even if you aren't, don't use, you get one with a really small internal storage, you can use that SD card as your mass storage, which seems to work pretty well. So some interesting perks with how they're using their software and specifically their OS that I've noticed, and I don't agree with all of them, but it's interesting and novel and kind of fun to talk about either way. So they decided they were going to have their root installed file system as a read-only file system, which I believe is a pretty common thing for kind of embedded type systems, and is kind of an interesting choice for Arch, because like Arch is a rolling release, but then they're saying like, yes, but we're not going to let you like muck with it. And we're going to release a whole new file system at a time every time we have a OS update. So they're kind of like using Arch as a non-rolling release, which is like a weird choice, but whatever. And not allowing you to, by default anyways, use any of the built-in package management system, and not using and also it comes with a password not defined by default. But it allows you to still install Linux applications by using KDE Discover or FlatHub. And I don't exactly like, I think that's using Flatpak in KDE Discover to install these things, but somehow, even though the root file system is completely root only, you can go in and, there's all sorts of things. I think VS Code is on there, Zoom is on there, GIMP is on there, LibreOffice is on there. Like you can go and do all those things. Some of the more interesting software anyways. One interesting thing is they allow you to turn that off. So that's in the next slide. You can turn off the read-only file system and then get full access to Pacman and Arch's wonderful AUR and all that fun. But yeah, and I talked about the touch-based scroll and mouse and keyboard. The keyboard, I think maybe I'll demonstrate the keyboard just a little bit here. I think it's, come on. Did it come? Oh, maybe I can't show the keyboard in presentation mode, which is fine. Okay. Anyways, so there's some quirks and caveats, but I think there's a lot of these things are optional, right? You can disable the read-only file system. You can enable a password, turn it into basically a real Arch install. And funny enough, even though they have a read-only password, they have Pacman installed by default. They also have Yay, which I don't know if anyone ever used Yowert, but or Yay, but it's an AUR helper, which is kind of like the experimental anyone could add stuff repos for Arch. And generally, like I would say AUR helpers is kind of a more interesting, advanced, potentially very dangerous thing you can add. And they threw this Yay on there by default. I don't think Arch usually has things by default, like it doesn't have why, like the fact that you have a AUR helper for a read-only file system machine by default, and you're taking up megabytes of your disk space for for something that is completely useless unless you turn off the read-only is weird to me. And I don't usually, I haven't used an AUR helper on my Arch installs for years and years and years, and like the fact that like Steam decided to include one, just I don't know, maybe tickled me in a weird way. Maybe no one else finds that interesting, but I find that very odd. But it's very convenient. It works pretty well. But the only thing that's about that is if you make install something from source or you add it through Pacman or Yay, they say they're not promising they're going to preserve your stuff when they have an operating system on it. So usually on Arch, I would avoid FlatHub or KDE Discover like the plague, and try to do everything through the package management system. But in this case, I feel like kind of it's a good thing. Like that's kind of maybe the preferred way, because then when SteamOS, releases a biannual update or whatever, it doesn't blast away changes you make, which is kind of concerning to me. But it hasn't been concerning enough that I want to completely rip out all of their interesting OS tweaks that they have that maybe might talk about a little bit. And then again, if you can install, you should be able to install relatively standard Linux distros as well beyond SteamOS, and install Windows if you want. But apparently, I haven't tried it, but the reviews I've heard, it makes it like it makes it seem like Windows on a Steam Deck is kind of not real great at all. So and you miss out on all the fun features like the mouse and the keyboard and things. Why did things turn white? Okay, here we go. So here's my complaint. So they're like any kind of newish device, there's some things that don't always, and like maybe kind of more niche device, there's some things that don't always work. The one thing that really grinds my gears the most about the software on this device that like it's really weird to explain is the right click sometimes forgets how to right click. And the best, most like reliable way to get it back is right click always works on Firefox. It may not work at like it's flaky as heck on everything else, but if you right click on Firefox, it'll recover itself and remember what a right click is. So if you right click on Firefox and then right click on what you actually want to right click on, it'll work every time. So there's times when I'll have a Firefox window open to do whatever I'm going to do, and I'll just have that Firefox window just to right click on Firefox so I can right click on my other window that I actually want to work on, which is ridiculous. But I found a very bulletproof, foolproof, always works workaround. So it's not that annoying, but it's kind of annoying. And so the other thing, as a diehard Vim user, there's no escape key on the on-screen keyboard, and I'll show the on-screen keyboard in a bit. And they have like literally every other key that any self-respecting programmer or command line user could ever want, except the escape key and then the function keys. But they have all the curly brackets, they have the square brackets, they have the angle brackets, they have the full thing, no escape key. Why there's no escape? They have the backtick, they have the tilde, they have no escape key. Why, I don't know. It's maddening. They do have, I believe it's Steam key plus left arrow is is tied to escape, which is just like a really hard thing to push. So they have a way to push it, but it's like, bleh. Yeah. Because there's no Control Alt F1 to like pop to a terminal to like P kill things that go out of hand. Sometimes I find myself pushing and holding the power button occasionally if things like really lock up. Because mostly because I'm too lazy to go grab a keyboard to type Control F1. to like get into like a terminal to like, hey, like, come on, Plasma, come on, Wayland, figure yourself out. So that's kind of the thing that I miss my F keys. Using so it comes built in with Proton. I haven't quite figured out how to get Proton to work outside of Steam. And so there's some things that I want to make work through Proton that aren't games. And the only way that I currently know how to do that is I have to add, my Office program or whatever garbage, like, Linux system tool or maybe Windows system tool or whatever, thing I want to run in Proton that's not a game. I have to add it to Steam as if it was a game. And maybe I need to research, maybe that's something everyone else knows how to do, but I haven't quite figured out yet. But that's kind of weird and I don't like it. There's no control or shift the way to do controller shift click by default, because if you turn on the on-screen keyboard, you lose your ability to click. And so I've had to, there's custom mapping. So I wound up mapping like control to one of the back buttons in desktop mode. So I can control click things because occasionally I find that really useful. There's no up and down arrows. That's the other thing missing on the on-screen keyboard. So I bound a couple of buttons to up and down, which, you wouldn't think is all that important until you like go to terminal and you're like, I want to do my last command over again. And it's like, there's no button for that. Which as a terminal user, really not great. I find the KDE like layout of all their plasmoids and buttons kind of the default really ugly. And so what you'll see is my preferred kind of customized version, not quite what the standard is. So I put that more as kind of a disclaimer for the demo that I'm going to do in a little bit. Come on, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so complaints. No, this is complaints. We already did complaints. Come on, show me the next one. Confusion. So there's a weird thing going on that I don't understand. There's a few weird things. I don't exactly know how KDE Discover works with the writing-only file system. I mentioned that before. I haven't quite figured that out. The other thing is supposedly my root volume that Pacman installs all of its package to is only supposed to be 5 gigabytes big. And I'm really confident I've installed more than 5 gigabytes of Pacman packages. And I haven't filled that up. And I know in the past that like trying to do symlinks or funny mount things to Pacman special directories really screws up Pacman and like really screws up Arch. And ask me how I know, because I've tried it a couple times, because my pack cache will get too big or whatever, and I'll try figuring out ways to get around that, and it doesn't go so well. So I have no idea what jiggery pokery, what magic they're able to do that allow me to install quite so much on software onto what's supposed to be only 5 gigabytes of space and not run it out. So somehow they're misdirecting something to the home partition somehow, or the SD card partition somehow that I don't quite understand, or maybe there's some weirdness with how they're doing the file system that's not standard Arch that I haven't figured out yet. So those are kind of the things I haven't figured out. But maybe some other folks, have answers to some of my questions. But I thought I'd mention that there's some things that I just like haven't quite figured out how they're doing it and what's going on. Yeah. So that's kind of and we'll get to the demo now. And sure. And then I have to figure out, how do I get out of here? There's my escape. Where's my mouse? Come back, mouse.